What's going on, everyone? It's Justin here, and today I've got a comparison for you between the iPad Pro with an M1 processor compared to last year's iPad Pro 2020. So the M1 processor has been a big talk for Apple since it came out last year. It is Apple's first time using their own chipset in a computer, but on the iPad line of things, they've always utilized Apple's own silicon and has really showcased the amount of power Apple's very own chips can do. And eventually, as that made its way over to the computer, we saw it at another scale. And with just how well that has gone, it is nice to see that Apple's flagship chipset that is currently available on the iMac, the Mac Mini, the MacBook Pro, as well as the Air is on a tablet. So today we're going to talk about some of the hardware differences as well as the display, whether or not I can notice a difference on the mini LED, as well as some real-world tests to show you whether or not the M1 processor and its improved CPU power and graphics, as well as Thunderbolt port, really brings a tangible difference that you're going to notice for your workflow. So it is no secret on the channel that I really like iPads, and although I haven't completely replaced my laptop with a tablet, I bring these around when I travel, and I essentially leave my laptop at home, and I also prefer it for photo editing, and generally speaking, I also like to use it for multimedia as well over a laptop. Apple's design has been really spot on with the iPad Pro line. It is essentially unchanged since it was announced in 2018, and I don't feel like they have to make any changes. This is probably one of Apple's best designed products overall. It looks good, it has like a nice squared off edge, and based on the rumors, it seems like the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro for late 2021 is going to follow the same design characteristics as the iPad. So right off the bat, right here I have the brand new M1 iPad Pro, and it comes in at a starting configuration of 128 gigs and all the way up to the 512 gig. It is an 8GB M1 unified memory CPU and GPU, whereas the 1 and 2 terabyte options come with 16 gigabytes of the unified memory. Last year's iPads, for example, came in 6 and 8GB RAM configurations for the 13-inch model Pro. So just on power alone, Apple promises 50% more CPU power and 40% more on the GPU. And numbers are one thing, but based on the benchmarks I'm going to show you, they actually did present real-world differences when compared to the previous generation and are things that you will definitely notice, especially if you're in the creative field or anything that involves large files or CPU and GPU rendering. The other thing is this 12.9-inch iPad has the mini LED display. The 11-inch doesn't, but some of the characteristics of the mini LED display is that it is up to 1000 nit and it also goes up to 1600 in HDR content compared to 600 on the previous generation iPad. Otherwise, when it comes to form factor and design, they look pretty much identical. The new iPad Pro is just a little bit thicker, and you may notice it when it's side by side, but honestly, the difference to that is very minimal. So yeah, in terms of hardware, I don't really think I have anything to say about that, but there are a lot of like small changes here and there, as well as big ones, such as the M1, which is kind of going to be like the trend of this video. If you guys enjoy Apple videos like this, where I go ahead and compare the products as soon as they come out, make sure you subscribe to the channel, drop a like on this video, and also leave a comment down below as to whether or not you think the changes on this brand new iPad Pro and the introduction of the M1 processor to a mobile system is game-changing. So when it comes to the display itself, which is what you're probably going to be looking at, the first thing I've got to say is that in regular use cases, you're really not going to notice a huge difference in terms of display quality or like the brightness on the iPad Pro 2021. It is definitely brighter when it comes to like HDR content. That is going to be a huge difference. But when it comes to just like doing your general productivity tasks, I didn't really notice anything crazy. And the big reason for that is because the display on the previous generation iPad Pro was already incredible. I had no complaints about it at all. Some of the benefits of the mini LED though is that it actually has 10,000 individually lit pixels. The nit count in terms of resolution and everything is exactly the same, but there's also 2,500 local dimming zones. So the blacks, the contrast, and just like subtle differences in the color when compared side by side, I may have noticed here and there, but it is more so Apple's new technology that is probably going to make its way to the MacBooks and eventually all the products in Apple's tablet and computer lineup. And the iPad has always kind of been the cutting edge of display technology because it's the first Apple device to have a 120 Hz display built in, and we expect to see that on the iPhone this year. Before we move on to the next category though, I want to give a huge thanks to the sponsor for this video. video, keeper security, and their password manager. So it's always fun to get a brand new tablet, computer, or smartphone, or any device as a matter of fact, but there's always one thing that is super annoying, and that is having to log into all of your accounts from scratch every single time. You often forget your passwords, you might have changed it recently, you might have like a two-factor setup, and that process makes it hard to transition to a brand new device when it should be like a very exciting part of your productivity workflow or just like a good refresh after many years. Thankfully, Keeper Security and their password manager allows you to just sign in with one master password, and all the passwords that you've stored in Keeper are all safe and secure, and you can automatically have it autofill in your applications to make that process very simple and just one click. If you want to go ahead and protect your current accounts, Keeper Security can also help you create and remember secure passwords so that all of your accounts don't use the exact same one. It protects your accounts from getting hacked, and they also have a built-in security audit that kind of lets you know what improvements you can make to all of your accounts that you have on the Keeper Security portal. I'm someone who just started using password managers about a year ago, and I wish I started way earlier because honestly that has just made the process super easy because we're switching between devices all the time for reviews. If you guys want to go ahead and check it out for yourself, I've got a link down below, and a huge thanks to them once again for sponsoring this video. Another difference that could also be very noticeable though is that the iPad Pro 2021 now has a Thunderbolt 3 port or USB 4, which gives you much faster speeds and a bandwidth of up to 40 gigabits per second. So based on our tests, when it came to plugging a standard SSD in and transferring photos, we noticed that it was actually a significant difference and about double the speed, which is in line of Apple's claims. With the Thunderbolt port, it also allows you to connect it up to a 6K display. So say you have like a Pro Display XDR, which is quite a bit of display to power, you can plug the iPad in and enjoy like the benefits of like a touchscreen or a pen experience on that large scale and large resolution. And that is all powered from the tablet itself. The next thing that is kind of worth talking about to a degree is the camera technology. And I know some people take photos on their iPad, whereas others really don't want to, but cameras have been pretty good on the tablets for quite a few years, and more so on the LiDAR side. Having LiDAR in a tablet allows for a whole range of use cases in AR and VR through the tablet ecosystem, but in terms of taking actual photos, it is still a 12 megapixel wide lens on both, a 10 megapixel ultra wide lens on both as well. You've got the LiDAR sensor with 4K video, but the new iPad Pro has extended dynamic range and also has true depth in the 12 megapixel ultra wide camera, as well as 2x optical zoom out true depth. So here's a look at a camera comparison between last year's iPad Pro and this year's iPad Pro with M1 chip. And I think the front-facing camera is where there was the biggest improvement overall. The previous one has a 7 megapixel sensor, whereas the new generation has a 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera. And through the machine learning and FaceTime, I actually just tested it out a couple minutes ago. It was able to actually track me all around the room. I was walking back and forth and just really trying to put it through its paces, because I know a lot of times with like machine learning stuff, it doesn't work that well. But it was able to do a great job in keeping me in the center frame. And I just find that this is actually a really nice practical feature. So yeah, let me know if you guys can notice a difference in the camera quality of the previous and current generation iPad Pro. So even though the rear cameras didn't see a huge change, which is totally fine, one area that I think a lot of people are going to find a practical use in is the improved front-facing camera. The iPad Pro 2020 has a 7 megapixel front, whereas the brand new iPad Pro 2021 has a 12 megapixel front-facing true depth camera. You might think like resolution doesn't really mean much, but I think the actual practical features that Apple has added are very important. It is actually a super wide camera, so it tracks where you're walking within the frame if you're on like FaceTime or a conference call, and it uses machine learning on the M1 processor to be able to do that. So say you're like just walking around in the kitchen or something, or you're like just moving around in a given set, the camera will actually track where you are in the room and make you in the center of the frame just to make the whole experience a bit more engaging. There's also center stage audio tracking as well. So I feel like for people who are doing a lot of conference calls and with like the whole pandemic thing and doing Zoom calls and for school and stuff, those are all features that people are going to find pretty effective in the practical scale. The other thing is also the introduction of 5G to the iPad. That made its way to the iPhone this year, and the iPad gets it. So if you're in an area that has 5G, then that is going to be a pretty big difference in terms of the speed that you're able to get. Personally, I don't actually use the cellular on my tablet because I have my phone on me at all times. So that is not something that I really use or notice. And in the area that I live in, 5G is not really present or like a real 5G experience. But for those who are going to use it, that could be huge if you're uploading or downloading large files. So one thing that people usually don't like to talk about in comparisons is just the general processing power, because when you're comparing smartphones, a lot of times nobody is really using the full power capability and like the small differences that you might notice between devices. But in this case, honestly, when it comes to comparing the M1 generation to a previous generation, I feel like the real world tests do speak for themselves, and I'm personally really excited to tell you the results that we got from our benchmarks. As I mentioned, the iPad Pro 2021 has the M1 processor, and it comes in the option of an 8 or 16 gigabyte unified M1 memory. That is the GPU and the CPU memory combined. So it is kind of a new system that a lot of general consumers are not familiar with. And even though on the MacBook line of things, you can go ahead and choose between 8 or 16 and just pay extra, on the iPad side of things, the 16 gigabyte max option is only available on a 1 or 2 terabyte storage configuration iPad. On the other hand, the iPad from last year has an A12Z Bionic processor with 6 gigs of RAM. And before we talk a little bit more about the benchmark scores, Apple claims a 50% improvement in CPU power and 40% on the GPU, and typically it is hard to see like a major difference, but I think with the combination of Thunderbolt 4 and like the faster transfer speeds and everything, as well as the processing power alone, we saw some pretty good numbers. Just starting out with raw benchmark, Geekbench 5 gave a score of 1125 on single core and 4686 on the multi-core for the iPad Pro 2020. When compared to the iPad Pro 2021, the single core score was 1700 and the multi-core is 7221. Just from that, it seems like there is a pretty good improvement, but that is just raw benchmarks and nobody really cares about that. But the next test that I also ran was 3D Mark Wildlife Benchmark Graphics Test, and on the iPad Pro 2020, I got a score of 3,513 and 21 frames per second, whereas on the iPad Pro 2021, the score came out to being nearly 5,000 and an average frame rate of almost 30 frames per second. One of the biggest things that I noticed on the M1 processor of the MacBook though is just how fast it is able to boot up and also wake from sleep. It is literally almost instant, so I figured I would test the boot up time of the iPads. And the brand new iPad Pro is about 3 seconds faster at about 13 seconds to fully boot up. So not a really big difference there, and definitely not a reason to go ahead and buy a brand new iPad. When it comes to battery drain though, you should get about 10 hours on both these tablets based on Apple's claims. But another area that I noticed a huge improvement on the MacBook side of things was the battery life. On my MacBook Air, I'm able to get like 2 to 3 days, so I figured I would test the battery life of both these tablets, and both of them are pretty much brand new, so there's literally no degradation in terms of the maximum hold capacity. On a test that we ran 4K footage at full brightness, the iPad Pro 2020 drained about 5% faster. After 1 hour, it was at 77% versus 85% on the iPad Pro 2021. And after an hour and a half, the iPad Pro 2020 was at 65%, whereas the iPad Pro 2021 was still at 75%. So generally speaking, we notice about a 10% difference, give or take, with margin of error being within 5%. So I would say the battery life that you should expect is pretty much the same, whether you get last year's model or this year's. When it came to editing photos though, that was like the only practical example that I could think of based on my uses that could test the transfer speed as well as the actual graphics and CPU capabilities when it came to a creative use. We used Lightroom to import 50 raw photos, and based on the import time alone, the iPad Pro 2021 was able to do it in 24 seconds compared to 41 seconds on the previous generation tablet. So that is an area where with a standard SSD, I noticed a huge difference when it came to the transfer speed thanks to Thunderbolt 3 and USB 4. The second test that we also ran though was making it edit on a photo and pasting it on all 50 raw images. And the iPad Pro with an M1 processor was able to do that in just 16 seconds compared to 28 seconds on the previous generation iPad. Generally speaking, based on like the real world tests as well as the benchmarks, it does seem that the claims of a 50% improvement in CPU and a 40% in GPU do seem to be in line. An improvement is always really nice to see, but I've never heard anybody complain about the iPad Pro not having enough power. And honestly, you can do like basic video editing, photo editing. It has always been a very creative tool for people who want to do creative work, general productivity, and even use AR and VR in ways that you wouldn't be able to in previous years. So I think like if you're really looking for a powerhouse to do all of your work on, the $100 price increase this year on the iPad Pro 2021 does make sense. The mini LED is a technology of the future, and if you're outside a lot, then you're going to notice a difference in the benefits. And if you're watching HDR content, that is obviously another area where it's going to be huge. The front-facing camera improvements are one of those things where I feel like if you have it, it's great, but you're really not going to need to buy a new tablet just for that. The Thunderbolt 3 and USB 4, I feel like is a pretty big difference, and I know a lot of people who edit a ton of stuff and transfer large files to their tablet, and especially if it's available in a 2 terabyte options, I'm sure there's a lot of people who are going to be doing that. I feel like that is a pretty significant difference, but most of all, the M1 processor inside and what it is able to deliver if you use the iPad on an everyday basis does make it all worth it. At the end of the day, even though the iPad looks exactly the same, and I know it's not as exciting or it doesn't feel like a large upgrade when the design hasn't changed at all, it's really because the iPad has no flaws in its design. It looks really good. The audio technology is great. The speaker configurations and like the bezel size with the pen placement and the keyboard, everything just kind of comes together. And I've got to say, it's got me more excited for the iPad lineup more than ever before. So as always, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know down in the comment section below if you'd like to see me do any other comparisons, and I'll see you all in the next one.